In May 1968, Newcastle upon Tyne simmered with the grit and grime of industrial life. Scotswood, a working-class neighbourhood, was a place of hard routines and close-knit familiarity until a series of events shattered its fragile sense of safety. On May 25th, 4-year-old Martin Brown was found dead in a derelict house. Though disturbing, his death was deemed accidental. There were no visible injuries, no clear cause. The community grieved and tried to move on. But on July 31st, 3-year-old Brian Howe disappeared. His body was found in a nearby wasteland, clearly murdered, strangled, punctured with scissors, and marked with chilling intent. A blonde hair, not his own, clung to his clothing. The brutality of the crime stirred fear and confusion, particularly when Crude. Threatening notes were found scrawled on a nursery wall, seemingly written by a child. Suspicion soon turned to 11-year-old Mary Bell, a local girl described as intelligent but unsettlingly mature for her age. Initially listed only as a witness, Mary's connection to both crime scenes, her eerie calm during questioning, and disturbing behaviors such as returning to the scene led investigators to a horrifying conclusion. The killer might be a child. The case defied comprehension. The idea of a young girl committing such calculated violence shook public perception of innocence to its core. Newspapers struggled to reconcile the terms child and killer, as Mary Bell's involvement became undeniable. The community and the nation were forced to confront a terrifying new reality. Evil can wear the face of a child. The truth, as you will soon discover, hides behind the eyes of a child and in the silence of those who should have seen it coming. For those brave enough to confront the stories most would rather forget, this channel is your safe place in the shadows. If you're ready to explore more, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and drop a comment below. What state are you watching from? Let's begin. Mary Flora Bell was born on May 26, 1957. In a world that seemed to reject her from the very beginning. Her entrance into life was marked not by warmth or celebration, but by suspicion and confusion. The midwife would later report that Betty Bell, Mary's mother, tried to give the newborn away, handing her to a passing stranger in the hospital corridor. She was just 17 at the time, already tangled in the shadowy edges of society. Known locally as a sex worker who frequented pubs more than she did her own home. From that first moment, Mary's existence felt less like a welcome and more like a warning. Raised in the working-class neighborhood of Scotswood, Mary's world was one of peeling wallpaper, cold dinners, and the ever-present sense of instability. Her father figure changed with unsettling frequencies. Some sources list Billy Bell, a habitual criminal, as her official stepfather, though others suggest her true paternity was never confirmed. What is known is that Betty Bell's men came and went, and many did not come for Mary's benefit. Neighbors whispered of strange disappearances, of long hours Mary was left alone, and of late-night visitors who entered Betty's home and sometimes disturbingly entered Mary's room. There were dark rumors that Betty offered her own child to clients. No proof was ever uncovered. No one came forward, but the silence surrounding it spoke volumes. Mary was injured frequently and mysteriously throughout her childhood. Hospital records documented multiple head injuries, unexplained bruises, and suspected overdoses of sleeping pills. It was said, by accident. Teachers recalled a moment when Mary calmly told them her mother had once tried to kill her. She said it with no fear, no urgency, as if narrating a bedtime story whose ending she had already accepted. Her affect was blank, her tone almost rehearsed. By age 5, Mary had already begun displaying early signs of sociopathic behavior. Animals in the neighborhood began disappearing. A dog was found, with its ribs crushed. A kitten's body was discovered beneath a pile of bricks near the Bell home. When confronted, Mary denied everything, her eyes wide with incredulity, as if offended by the accusation. But other children started to avoid her. They spoke of cruel games, suffocation tests, pinching contests, threats whispered behind schoolyard hedges. She was clever, they admitted, always clever, but there was something unnatural in the way she watched people, especially when they cried. Her teachers, too, sensed something was off. She was disruptive, but not in the usual way. She was articulate, even charming when she wanted to be. Yet her drawings were often violent figures, with slashed throats. Dark red scribbles labeled death in block letters. One day, she brought a dead bird to class, and calmly placed it on the desk of a classmate she disliked. She didn't laugh, she didn't flinch. She simply watched. Still, in a world that made excuses for poverty, where the extraordinary was often masked by the overwhelming presence of the ordinary, these warning signs slipped through the cracks. Scotswood was full of troubled children. Mary was just one of many. And yet, beneath her quiet gaze, behind the faint smile she sometimes wore when others cried, a different truth was forming, one that no adult dared imagine. Decades later, long after the courtroom lights had dimmed and the news headlines faded, a series of private journals were discovered among sealed psychiatric records. The handwriting was neat, the phrasing precise. In those pages, Mary had documented her thoughts as a child, not as confessions, but as statements of fact, clinical, observational. One entry read, "I hurt things because I want to know what's inside when the crying stops." Another simply asked, "Does God see children like me?" Her journal entries uncovered decades later would expose thoughts no child should think. On a damp morning in late May 1968, in the Scotswood area of Newcastle upon Tyne, the body of 4-year-old Martin Brown was discovered inside an abandoned, dilapidated house. The building, long neglected and partially collapsed, was a familiar but forbidding presence in the neighborhood. Martin's death was initially ruled accidental. There were no clear signs of violence or struggle. Too many, it seemed like a tragic mishap in a place where children often played despite the dangers. The official report cited an accidental cause of death, but lingering questions remained unresolved. Not long after, a nearby nursery was vandalized. The walls bore unsettling messages scrawled in childish handwriting, phrases that suggested something far darker than ordinary mischief. Authorities initially dismissed these as the work of local youths seeking attention, but the ominous tone of the writing haunted the investigation. The graffiti hinted at knowledge of the earlier tragedy, raising concerns about the involvement of children who might have been exposed to or involved in disturbing events. Then, in late July, 3-year-old Brian Howe was found deceased in a field not far from where Martin had been discovered. This time, the circumstances were more alarming. The autopsy revealed signs of strangulation and other injuries that suggested intentional harm. Among the evidence was a pair of scissors found close to the scene. The precision of some injuries indicated a certain level of knowledge or intent. Yet the size and nature of the marks pointed toward someone smaller, possibly a child, rather than an adult. This contradiction puzzled investigators, challenging conventional assumptions about the case. Witnesses began to speak of 2 young girls seen with Brian shortly before his disappearance, one of whom was reportedly laughing. This observation added a chilling new layer to the mystery. The presence of children near both scenes suggested that the perpetrator might not fit the usual profile of a criminal. Instead, the investigators were confronted with the unsettling possibility that someone very young could be responsible for these tragic events. The community was gripped by fear and confusion. How could such harm come from within their own neighborhood and from children who were expected to be innocent? The official files were soon sealed, and much of the case was kept from public view. Yet the questions surrounding these deaths continued to resonate. Who were these children? What drove them to such actions? And how did the ordinary world of Scotswood conceal such a dark secret? The search for answers was only beginning. From the moment Mary Bell and Norma Belter girls, unrelated but inexplicably entwined in the unfolding tragedy, were brought in for questioning, the atmosphere shifted. The police station, usually a place of stark authority, felt almost surreal as the girls sat side by side, their small frames shadowed by the weight of suspicion far beyond their years. Both were initially cooperative, offering fragments of stories that wavered between innocence and something far darker. Yet, as hours passed, the inconsistencies piled up. Where one would deny an event, the other hinted at it. Where one claimed ignorance, the other offered unsettlingly precise details. It was a tangle of half-truths and carefully constructed lies. Mary's demeanor throughout was unlike anything the officers had encountered before. She was cold, emotionally distant, yet not merely unfeeling. There was an unsettling, rehearsed quality to her words, as though she had prepared her responses in advance. At times, when the questioning veered towards the tragic, her lips curled into something resembling a smile, a gleam of gleeful detachment that unnerved even the most seasoned detectives. She asked to return to the scene of Brian Howe's death and, against protocol, was allowed to do so under supervision. There, witnesses later recounted, Mary approached the lifeless child, touched his body with a strange fascination, and then laughed quietly as bystanders wept. This reaction defied conventional understanding of grief or remorse. Faced with this disturbing behavior, the police began to rely heavily on psychological expertise. Child psychologists and psychiatrists were brought in, their interviews meticulously recorded and analyzed. One detective's notes captured the eerie impression Mary left. It was as if she enjoyed the hunt. The professionals debated fiercely, could someone so young truly possess such cold calculation? Was this the manifestation of trauma, or something innate? As layers peeled back, a profile emerged. A child who manipulated those around her with unnerving ease, who relished control and dominance, and who seemed to blur the lines between fantasy and reality. Norma Bell, in contrast, struggled under the pressure. Eventually, she broke down during interrogation, her stories tumbling out in fragments. She described games that had taken place among the children, games that seemed innocuous at first, but grew increasingly sinister. Suffocation contests, cruel dares, rehearsals of death played out in shadowed corners and abandoned yards. Norma painted Mary as the leader, the one who directed these acts with cold precision. She told us what to do, Norma whispered in a trembling voice. She said it was like acting, like a play. But sometimes it wasn't pretend. Her confession provided chilling insight into the dynamic between the two girls and suggested a deliberate, orchestrated cruelty rather than accidental harm. Despite Norma's revelations, the investigators needed irrefutable proof, something that could anchor the case beyond hearsay and confessions from children whose memories and perceptions were inherently fragile. That proof came from an unexpected source, Mary's own handwriting. Buried in the margins of a school notebook, hidden in plain sight among mundane homework assignments, were cryptic notes and drawings that spoke of death and power. They were not childish scribbles, but calculated messages, revealing a mind fascinated by mortality and control. Phrases like, "I make them die, and they are my puppets," hinted at a dark psychology that no adult could have implanted. These annotations became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Yet even with this evidence, the questions remained. What drove Mary Bell to such extremes? How could a child so young commit acts so brutal and calculated? The official files remained sealed, the truth locked away behind cold bureaucracy. But the shadow of those chilling pages lingered, promising a darkness that refused to be forgotten. The courtroom was thick with tension the day Mary Bell appeared to face the charges against her. At 11 years old, she was a child, yet accused of acts so incomprehensible that the assembled public struggled to reconcile innocence with brutality. As the charges were read aloud, 2 counts of manslaughter, the room collectively gasped, the weight of disbelief settling over all present. Mary sat motionless, her expression unreadable, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the rows of spectators and legal officials, as if detached from the grim reality unfolding around her. The trial was not just a legal proceeding. It was a confrontation with a paradox that unsettled society itself, a child as both victim and perpetrator. Innocence and malevolence entwined in a single, unfathomable figure. Experts called to testify grappled with terminology that felt inadequate. Psychopathy, sociopathy, emotional detachment labels were offered and debated, yet none fully captured the complexity of Mary's mind. Psychiatrists described her as disturbingly manipulative, yet also deeply wounded, as capable of calculated cruelty, yet a product of relentless trauma. The courtroom became a theater for the collision of science, morality, and fear. The public was outraged, not merely by the crimes, but by the very notion that a child could be responsible. Letters poured into newspapers, community meetings were held, and an undercurrent of horror and fascination rippled through Newcastle and beyond. Ultimately, Mary Bell was found guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The verdict acknowledged a fracture in her psychological makeup, a barrier that both condemned and excused her actions. She was sentenced to be detained indefinitely in a secure facility designed for children with severe mental health issues. The decision reflected a society wrestling to balance justice and compassion, punishment and rehabilitation, certainty and doubt. Mary's life behind closed doors remained largely a mystery. Official records were heavily redacted, her identity protected under multiple aliases to shield her from public scrutiny and to facilitate eventual reintegration. In 1980, after years in institutional care, she was quietly released. Reports indicate she assumed a new identity, married, and became a mother in existence, starkly removed from the chilling headlines of her youth. To some, this transformation suggested redemption. To others, a lingering shadow of doubt remained, as if the past could never be fully erased. The case of Mary Bell continues to provoke reflection and debate. Could she have been saved? Was she simply a monster in miniature, or a tragic product of monstrous circumstances? These questions defy easy answers. They invite us to consider the fragile boundaries between innocence and evil, between nurture and nature, and between society's failures and individual accountability. Mary's story challenges us to look beyond sensational headlines and confront uncomfortable truths about childhood, trauma, and justice. And yet, despite decades passing, the final chapter remains unwritten. Some say Mary Bell changed, that the darkness that once consumed her was overcome by time, therapy, and a semblance of normalcy. Others whisper that she never stopped watching, that the same cold, calculating gaze that once unnerved a courtroom continues to lurk in the shadows of her new life. The files may be sealed, the official story told, but the haunting questions persist, echoing long after the courtroom emptied and the cameras turned away. Who was Mary Bell? And what, truly, lies behind the silence?